Usually when we talk about trying to manage a household, there is this expectation of at least some baseline chaos.
Oh, absolutely. Just a constant hum of background noise.
Right. I mean, imagine trying to manage a house with a dozen highly opinionated adults under one roof. Everyone has their own schedule, their own dietary restrictions, their own very firm ideas about how the budget should be spent.
And you are the one trying to keep the lights on.
Exactly. You're trying to balance the checkbook and stop them from entirely tearing the place apart over, a disagreement about the thermostat.
It requires a tremendous amount of continuous, just exhausting negotiation.
It's a delicate balancing act on a good day. But now take that image of a chaotic household and multiply it by 1 billion people.
Yeah, that's quite a scale up.
Throw in dozens of major languages, vastly different cultural histories spanning thousands of years, and massive geographical differences, from the freezing Himalayas to the tropical coastlines.
It's staggering when you really think about it.
When you were dealing with that level of sheer scale and diversity, how does the entire structure not just instantly shatter into 100 different pieces?
Well, that is the ultimate administrative and political puzzle of the 20th century.
Right.
You are looking at a system that needs to be rigid enough to hold everyone together in a unified nation state, but flexible enough so that nobody feels suffocated, politically marginalized, and decides to just leave the house entirely.
And that profound tension, that incredibly intricate puzzle of power and survival is exactly what we are focusing on for you today. Welcome to another deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today, we are unpacking the intricate, sometimes messy, but undeniably brilliant world of center-state relations in India.
It's a fascinating subject.
And I want to speak directly to you, the learner. Whether you are actively studying for your Osmania University LLB exams, specifically Constitutional Law 2 Unit 3, or you are just trying to fundamentally understand how the world's largest democracy actually functions day to day, understanding this dynamic is the skeleton key.
It truly is. Because the story of India's governance isn't just about, a prime minister or a parliament.
Right.
It is about a constant, grinding, and fascinating friction between the central authority in New Delhi and the powerful, diverse state governments. Cooperative and competitive federalism all mixed together.
So to start us off and define the playing field here, India is described in Article 1 of its constitution as a union of states.
Yes, very specific phrasing there.
Now, to an outside observer, that sounds a lot like the United States of America. But the mechanics underneath that phrase are totally different, aren't they?
Completely different. What's fascinating here is that the phrasing union of states is very deliberate. It was chosen precisely to clarify that India is not a pure federation like the U.S.
Okay, how so?
Well, in the American historical context, you had independent sovereign states like Virginia and New York that essentially came together, sat around a table, and made a voluntary agreement to form a nation.
Right, the states existed first and they built the center.
Exactly. India is the reverse. The framers of the Indian Constitution designed what legal scholars call a quasi-federal structure.
Okay, let's unpack this. Quasi-federal. So it's functioning like a federation, but with a massive asterisk attached to it.
Yeah, that asterisk is a very strong, heavily armed center, the Union government, paired with relatively weaker states.
And why design it that way? Why the imbalance?
To understand why, you have to look at the historical trauma of 1947. Independence did not happen in a vacuum. It happened alongside the brutal, bloody reality of partition.
Right. It's an incredibly volatile time.
Exactly. The framers looked at the vast diversity of the country, the hundreds of princely states that had to be integrated, the incredible variety of languages and religious factions, and they were, frankly, genuinely terrified.
Wow.
The prevailing fear was that without an iron grip at the center, the newly independent country might just balkanize. It could splinter into dozens of separate, smaller, warring nations.
So they couldn't afford a weak central government that just politely asked the states to cooperate?
No, not at all.
They needed a central authority powerful enough to act as the ultimate glue, forcefully holding the map together if necessary.
Precisely. The federal structure is there to accommodate local governance because you cannot micromanage a country of that size from one city. But the strong unitary bias, that powerful center, is the constitutional safety net.
It's the fail-safe.
Right. It ensures national unity and integrity. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, the chief architect of the Constitution, made it clear the union is indestructible.
Meaning the states can't just opt out.
Exactly. The states have no right to unilaterally secede. They are part of the union permanently, whether they like the current central government or not.
which sets up an incredible dynamic. You have this giant, complex machine, and we need to figure out how it operates without tearing itself apart.
And that starts with the rules.
Right. Before you can govern a territory, before you can collect taxes or deploy the police, you fundamentally need to know who is allowed to write the rules. If the center and the states are sharing this space, who gets to legislate what?
This brings us to the very blueprint of power in India, the legislative relations.
Okay, let's dive into that.
The Constitution does not leave this to chance or ad hoc negotiations. It provides an incredibly strict organizational chart for who gets to make laws about what, laid out in the 7th schedule, specifically under Article 246.
I like to think of this like a massive, multinational corporate organizational chart. You have the global CEO, you have the regional managers, and they each have their own fiercely guarded portfolios.
That's a great analogy. The 7th schedule takes every possible subject a government might want to regulate and drops it into one of 3 distinct buckets or lists.
It is essentially the world's most high-stakes sorting exercise, designed to prevent the center and the states from constantly tripping over each other.
Exactly. It minimizes the collisions.
Right. So bucket number 1 is the Union List, also known as List I. This is the exclusive domain of the Parliament in New Delhi. Historically, it started with 97 subjects. Functionally, it operates with around 100 now. What makes the cut for List I?
Well, this list is reserved for subjects of absolute unquestionable national importance. We are talking about the survival and sovereign identity of the state itself.
Things you can't really divide up.
Right. Defense of the country, foreign affairs, atomic energy, the railways, banking, currency and coinage, the Reserve Bank of India, citizenship, extradition. Only the Parliament can touch these subjects.
And the logic there is undeniable. I mean, you can't have the state of Maharashtra deciding it wants to sign a separate peace treaty with a foreign power.
Oh, that would be chaos.
Or the state of Kerala deciding it wants to print its own currency to solve a local debt crisis. That completely shatters the illusion of a single sovereign nation.
Exactly. You need a unified, impenetrable front for the really critical nation-defining architecture. If a foreign nation deals with India, they need to know they are dealing with one entity, not 30 different semi-independent republics.
Makes total sense. So then we move down the corporate ladder to bucket number 2, the state list, or list 2. This one has about 61 subjects currently. What are the states exclusively allowed to govern?
These are areas of distinct local or regional concern. Under normal circumstances, only the state legislatures can make laws on these subjects.
Like what?
It includes vital day-to-day realities, public order, the police including railway and village police, public health and sanitation, agriculture, state-level elections, and local government structures like municipalities.
Wait, why police and agriculture? Why wouldn't the central government want to control the cops everywhere?
Because local problems require deeply localized solutions and cultural fluency.
Okay, expand on that.
Take agriculture. The agricultural needs, the soil types, the irrigation challenges of a mountain state like Himachal Pradesh are entirely different from the agricultural needs of a coastal state like Andhra Pradesh.
Right, a blanket national farming law might benefit one and devastate the other.
Exactly. Similarly, with policing, maintaining public order requires an understanding of the local language, the local social dynamics, and the specific historical friction points of a region.
So a police force directed entirely from New Delhi would be too detached to be effective.
Precisely. They wouldn't have the ground-level context.
Okay, so we have the center handling the macro sovereignty stuff and the states handling the localized operational stuff. But the world isn't cleanly divided into macro and micro. There has to be overlap.
And that is exactly why the framers created the third bucket list 3, the concurrent list. It currently has 52 subjects. This is where both the parliament and the state legislatures are constitutionally permitted to make laws.
Our sources highlight a great quote from the jurist M.V. Pyle, who called the concurrent list a twilight zone.
Yes, a twilight zone of cooperative lawmaking. It is a brilliant description because it operates in the gray area between pure federalism and a unitary state.
What's in this twilight zone?
Subjects include criminal law, marriage and divorce, bankruptcy, education, forests, and labor welfare.
Let me push back on that for a second. Why education? Shouldn't education just be a local issue? Why does the center need to be involved in what a middle school in Tamil Nadu is teaching?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture of national development, the logic becomes clear. The idea behind the concurrent list is that these are areas where you want a baseline of national uniformity.
Okay.
So the center can pass a broad framework law ensuring every child gets a minimum standard of education. But you simultaneously need to permit flexibility so states can adapt the curriculum to their specific regional languages and histories.
I see. So the center sets the floor, but the states can build the house.
That's a perfect way to put it. The same goes for criminal law. You want a unified penal code, so murder is treated as murder everywhere, but a state might need to pass concurrent legislation to deal with a very specific, localized type of organized crime.
Okay, that makes practical sense.
Right.
But wait, let's look at the timeline here. The Constitution was drafted in the late 1940s. It came into effect in 1950.
Right.
The framers were brilliant, visionary people, but they were still human beings living in the mid-20th century. They couldn't exactly foresee cyber warfare, cryptocurrency, artificial intelligence, or commercial spaceflight.
Obviously not.
So when a completely unprecedented subject emerges today, something that isn't on List 1, List 2, or List 3, who gets to make laws about it, does it become a free-for-all?
Not at all. The framers anticipated the unknown, and they addressed it through the concept of residuary powers, which is located in Article 248 and specifically Entry 97 of the Union List.
Okay, how does that work?
And frankly, this is where the quasi-federal nature of India is perhaps most starkly visible. Look at a true federation like the United States again.
Right, the 10th Amendment.
Exactly. The 10th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution explicitly states that any power not specifically delegated to the federal government belongs to the states or the people. The states get the benefit of the doubt.
But India flips that.
Entirely on its head. In India, any matter not explicitly enumerated in the state list or the concurrent list automatically, by default, falls to the parliament. The center gets all the leftover undefined powers.
Wait, so if the Siddhartha gets all the unknown future powers, doesn't that guarantee that over a 100-year or 200-year timeline, the states will eventually become powerless administrative shells?
That's a very real concern.
I mean, every time human technology evolves, every time society creates a new paradigm, New Delhi automatically gets the jurisdiction. That feels like a ticking time bomb for state autonomy.
That is a very profound critique of the system, and it is a tension that state governments frequently point out. The centralizing gravity is inescapable.
Have they actually used this?
Oh, absolutely. The sources give historical examples of this in action, like how Parliament used residuary powers to enact the Commission of Inquiry Act in 1952 or the Compulsory Deposit Scheme.
They just claimed it.
Yeah, they didn't need to amend the Constitution to take those powers. They just claimed them from the residuary pool. The framers prioritized a dynamic, evolving central authority over preserving static state domains.
Wow. Let's go back to that twilight zone of the concurrent list for a moment, because that seems like an absolute powder keg.
It definitely can be.
If both the center and the state are allowed to make laws on a subject, let's use labor welfare as an example. Suppose the central government passes a law saying all factories must allow a 40-hour work week.
Okay.
But a specific state government, desperate to attract foreign manufacturing, passes a law on the exact same day saying factories in their state can mandate a 60-hour work week. Those two laws directly, fundamentally contradict each other. Who wins?
Good question.
Do they just take it to the Supreme Court and let the judges flip a coin?
The Constitution doesn't leave it to a coin flip. This exact scenario is governed by the doctrine of repugnancy, which is enshrined in Article 254.
Doctrine of repugnancy. Sounds intense.
It operates somewhat similarly to the doctrine of occupied field in American jurisprudence. In India's structure, if there is a conflict, a true irreconcilable inconsistency where obeying one law means breaking the other between a law made by the state legislature and a law made by parliament on a concurrent list subject, the union law prevails.
The center wins. Again.
The center wins. The state law becomes void, but, and this is a critical legal distinction, it only becomes void to the extent of the repugnancy.
Ah, so they don't throw the whole baby out with the bathwater.
Exactly. The entire state law isn't necessarily thrown out, just the specific clauses that clash with the central law.
So the strong unitary bias asserts itself whenever there's friction.
It does, but there is a fascinating and crucial loophole built right into the text of Article 254, and it is a lifeline for states that truly need to deviate from the national norm.
I love a good loophole. How does it work?
If the state legislature passes a law on a concurrent subject that contradicts an existing parliamentary law, they don't just enforce it and wait to be sued. They reserve that specific state law for the consideration of the President of India.
Okay, so they send it up the chain of command to the very top.
Exactly. And if that contradicting state law receives the President's assent first, then that state law actually prevails in that specific state despite contradicting the central law.
Okay, let's unpack this. So a state can effectively carve out a legal sanctuary, completely overriding the center within its own geographical borders, provided the president explicitly signs off on it.
Yes. The purpose is to allow for genuine, recognized regional exceptions.
That's interesting.
If a state can prove to the president, which functionally means proving it to the central cabinet, who advises the president that their local conditions require a different labor standard or a different educational framework, they can get permission to override the national law locally.
That feels like a massive concession to the states.
It is until you read the next
Oh,
clause.
there's catch.
Always a catch. The parliament still retains the ultimate upper hand. Even if a state law gets presidential assent and prevails locally, Parliament is not permanently locked out.
What can they do?
Parliament can, at any subsequent time, enact a brand new law, adding to, amending, varying, or completely repealing that specific state law.
Wow. So the state asks for permission, the center grants it, but the center keeps their finger hovering over the undo button forever.
That's exactly it.
It is a constant game of legislative chess. But the center is playing with extra queens, while the states are just trying to hold the line with pawns. And looking at the mechanics here, the center can actually just completely hijack the state list under certain circumstances, right? The exclusive domain of the states isn't actually that exclusive.
That is correct. The Constitution details several specific extreme scenarios where Parliament can legally step directly into List 2 and legislate on a state's exclusive domain.
Walk me through those scenarios. How does New Delhi legally commandeer state power?
Well, the first mechanism is Article 249. This is the national interest override. Now, Parliament can't just declare a national interest on its own. It requires the Rajya Sabha.
The upper house.
Right, the Council of States, which consists of representatives from the states themselves. If the Rajya Sabha passes a resolution with a two-thirds majority of members present and voting, declaring that it is necessary in the national interest for Parliament to make a law on a state list subject, Parliament gets the green light.
Okay, that actually seems somewhat democratic in a federal sense. If the state's own representatives at the federal level overwhelmingly agree, yes, this local issue has become a national crisis, New Delhi needs to handle it, then the center gets temporary jurisdiction. How long does that last?
That authorization lasts for up to 1 year, though it can be renewed.
Got it. What's the next one?
The second mechanism is Article 250, which is much more blunt. During a proclamation of national emergency, Parliament is automatically empowered to legislate on any state subject for the entire country.
Which is pure crisis management. If the country is at war or facing massive internal rebellion, you can't be arguing over which list public order falls under. You need a unified command.
Precisely. Then we have Article 252, which is the cooperative mechanism.
Cooperative, how so?
If two or more states voluntarily pass resolutions in their own legislatures, essentially saying, we have this problem, but we don't have the resources or the coordination to regulate it ourselves, we request Parliament to make a law for us, Parliament can step in.
Oh, I see.
But importantly, that law will only apply to the states that ask for it or states that adopt it later.
It's like outsourcing your legislative burden to the federal government.
Exactly. And finally, there is Article 253, which is the International Treaty Override. This is vital for India's standing in the world.
Correct.
Parliament has the power to make laws on strictly state subjects if it is necessary to implement any international treaty, agreement, or convention.
Let me make sure I understand the mechanics of that. Let's say India signs an aggressive international climate change treaty in Paris, and that treaty requires cutting carbon emissions by 50%.
A very realistic scenario.
But let's say a state like Jharkhand relies heavily on coal mining, and mining is generally a state-regulated industrial activity. Can the center use Article 253 to pass a law forcing Jharkhand to shut down its coal mines, even though mining regulation would normally be a state prerogative?
Yes, absolutely. You cannot have a scenario where the sovereign nation of India signs a treaty and a single state's local industrial policy causes the entire country to violate international law.
Right, that would be humiliating internationally.
Exactly. Article 253 ensures that when New Delhi makes a promise to the world, New Delhi has the constitutional authority to force the states to keep that promise.
The overwhelming tilt toward the center in all of these scenarios is staggering. I know this structure was challenged in a massive way early on in the Republic's history. The dispute reached the highest levels in the case of State of West Bengal v. Union of India in 1963. What happened there?
That case is foundational because it forced the Supreme Court to explicitly define what Indian federalism actually was.
So what was the conflict?
The central government had passed a law, the Coal-Bearing Areas Act, which allowed New Delhi to acquire land containing coal deposits. West Bengal, which is rich in coal, sued.
On what grounds?
Their argument was fundamentally about sovereignty. They argued that the Indian Constitution was federal, that states were sovereign within their own spheres, and therefore the Union government could not just forcefully acquire property owned by a sovereign state government without their consent.
They were trying to draw a hard line in the sand. They were saying, you might be the center, but this is our land. We are a sovereign state. You can't touch it.
Exactly. And the Supreme Court completely dismantled West Bengal's argument. The court ruled unequivocally that the Indian Constitution is not a traditional federal constitution.
Going back to the quasi-federal idea.
Yes. It is not based on a compact or an agreement among previously independent states. Therefore, the states in India simply do not possess true, absolute sovereignty.
So the court looked at the entire structure we just discussed, the overrides, the residuary powers, the repugnancy doctrine, and said, look at the blueprint. The states are not equals in this relationship.
Correct. The court affirmed that Parliament possesses wider paramount legislative authority. The states operate within the bounds of a system fundamentally designed to keep the Union supreme. West Bengal lost, and the central law prevailed.
Okay, so the center clearly, undeniably dictates the rules of the game. They hold the legislative high ground. But here is the reality of governing. Rules are entirely useless without the funds to implement them.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, you could pass all the ambitious public health laws or police reform laws or agricultural subsidy laws you want, but if you cannot pay the doctors, equip the police officers, or actually distribute the cash to the farmers, those laws are just ink on paper.
The machinery of the state runs on capital.
Right. Which brings us to the second phase of our deep dive, following the money, or the financial relations between the center and the states. And if you thought the legislative relations were tilted toward the center, the financial relations make the center's dominance glaringly, painfully obvious.
The framers understood that political power is ultimately downstream of economic power. So they structured the financial relationship to ensure the center would never be starved of resources, even if it meant leaving the states constantly hungry.
And this creates what economists call a vertical fiscal imbalance.
Ah.
The states are saddled with massive, relentlessly growing expenditure responsibilities. They are the ones actually delivering governance to the citizen. They have to fund the vast police forces, build the local public health infrastructure, maintain state highways, fund the agriculture departments. The daily, expensive grind of running a society falls on the states.
But the center has been given the most lucrative, high-yielding, and elastic revenue-raising powers.
Right, the big ones.
Yes. The Constitution assigns the big moneymakers to New Delhi: income tax, customs duties, corporation tax. The taxes that grow exponentially as the economy modernizes are overwhelmingly controlled by the Union.
So the states have the bills, and the center has the credit cards. How does the Constitution even attempt to bridge that gap?
Through a highly complex, tiered flow of money governed by Articles 268 through 293. The Constitution divides the taxing powers strictly to avoid double taxation, but because the division is unequal, it creates mechanisms to funnel money back down.
Walk me through the tiers.
At the first level, under Article 268, you have certain taxes like stamp duties on financial documents or excise duties on medicinal preparations that are listed in the Union list.
Meaning only the center can set the rate.
Right. That means only the center has the authority to levy or legally impose the tax rate. However, the center doesn't actually collect the money. The Constitution says these taxes shall be collected by the states within their own territories, and the states get to keep the money entirely. It never enters the central consolidated fund.
Okay, so the center acts as the rate setter, but the states do the administrative legwork of collection and pocket the cash. It's a small concession. What's the next level?
Next is Article 269. Here you have taxes that are both levied and collected by the central government.
Okay.
But once the center collects all that money, they are not allowed to keep it. The net proceeds are assigned entirely to the states, distributed according to principles formulated by Parliament.
Why would the center go through the hassle of collecting a tax if they don't keep a single rupee of it?
Usually because it involves interstate transactions. For example, taxes on the sale or purchase of goods taking place in the course of interstate trade.
Oh, that makes sense.
If an item is moving across 3 state borders, it is an administrative nightmare for the states to tax it individually. So the center steps in, handles the collection efficiently at the national level, and then hands the money back to the states.
But those are the smaller pools of money. The real lifeblood of the system is the shared taxes, right?
Yes, under Article 270, this is the core of the financial relationship. Taxes levied and collected by the center, but mandatorily shared between the union and the states.
Like income tax.
Historically, yes, primarily income tax, but this entire landscape was violently, radically disrupted and rebuilt by the introduction of the GST.
The goods and services tax.
Yeah.
The sources note this was brought in by the 101st Amendment Act. This wasn't just a tweak to the tax code. This is a fundamental rewiring of the Indian economy.
It was arguably the most significant economic reform since independence. To understand why it was necessary, you have to picture what interstate trade looked like before GST. It was a logistical and economic nightmare of cascading taxation.
What does cascading taxation actually look like on the ground?
Imagine a truck carrying manufactured goods from a factory in Gujarat trying to deliver them to a buyer in West Bengal.
Okay, a long drive.
Before GST, as soon as that truck left the factory, the center charged an excise duty. Then, Gujarat charged a state sales tax. When the truck crossed into Maharashtra, it had to stop at a physical border checkpoint to pay an entry tax or octroi.
Oh, wow.
Then it crossed into another state, another tax. And here's the kicker. The subsequent states were calculating their tax not just on the base value of the goods, but on the value of the goods plus all the taxes that had already been paid to the previous states.
You were paying a tax on a tax on a tax.
Exactly. It artificially inflated the cost of goods tremendously. But worse, it created invisible economic walls between the states.
What do you mean by walls?
Well, a manufacturer in Tamil Nadu might find it cheaper to import a component from China than to buy it from Punjab simply because of the internal tax barriers. The states were essentially operating as separate economic countries, setting up protectionist policies to maximize their own local revenue at the expense of the national market.
Which brings us back to the core fear of the framers' balkanization, but this time through economics.
Precisely.
Our sources tie this directly to Article 301 of the Constitution, which guarantees the freedom of trade, commerce, and intercourse throughout the territory of India. It declares that trade should be free. And there's that incredible, piercing quote from Karl Marx in our notes, "All human relations are economical relations."
It is a profound inclusion in the source material because it strikes at the heart of federalism.
Yeah, if they can't trade, they can't stay united.
Exactly. The framers understood Marx's premise. If states are economically isolated, if they are engaging in trade wars with each other over border taxes, the political unity of the country will inevitably decay. Economic unity is the absolute non-negotiable prerequisite for political unity.
So how did GST knock those walls down?
By subsuming almost all of those indirect taxes, the state sales taxes, the central excise duties, the octroi into a single comprehensive tax. More importantly, it introduced a concurrent taxing structure.
Under Article 246A, right?
Yes. Both the union and the states now have simultaneous power to levy GST on a common tax base.
So they are finally taxing together rather than fighting over the scraps.
Yes, and it is governed by the GST Council, which is a fascinating constitutional experiment. It includes the union finance minister and the finance ministers of all the states.
Looks like a tough room.
Oh, definitely. They have to sit in a room and agree on the tax slabs together. It is designed to ensure a smooth, common, national market. It is the very definition of cooperative federalism forced into practice by economic necessity.
Okay, I see the brilliance of a unified market. But let's look at the dark side of this dependency. Even with shared taxes like GST, I have to ask, if the states have all these heavy, crushing responsibilities, hospitals, police, roads, and they are constantly waiting for New Delhi to transfer their share of the revenue every month, doesn't that make the states completely politically subservient?
That is the danger of the vertical imbalance.
Right, because if you rely on someone else for your allowance, you kind of have to do what they say. If a state is governed by an opposition party that is fiercely critical of the prime minister, what is stopping the central cabinet from just saying, you know what, we're going to delay your tax share this month. Let's see how long you can survive without paying your state police.
That would be disastrous.
They could use funding as a political weapon to literally starve out opposition governments.
This raises a critical point of constitutional design, and the framers were acutely, painfully aware of this exact danger. They knew that if the distribution of money was left purely to the political discretion of the party in power at the center, federalism would be a sham.
So how do they stop it?
So they built in powerful constitutional safeguards. The first layer is grants and aid under Article 275.
How does that work?
The union government is mandated to provide grants to states that are genuinely in need of financial assistance over and above their tax share. This is often used to support specific welfare schemes, raise the level of administration in tribal areas, or fund massive capital projects that a state couldn't afford alone.
But again, who decides who is in need? If the Prime Minister's cabinet decides which states get the grants, we are back to the exact same problem. They will just give the grants to states controlled by their own political party.
And that is precisely why the Constitution established the Finance Commission under Article 280. This is the cornerstone of Indian fiscal federalism.
Okay, tell me about the Finance Commission.
The Finance Commission is an independent constitutional body. It is set up by the president every 5 years.
What is their actual mandate?
Their entire job is to act as an impartial mathematical referee. They analyze the macro-financial health of the center and all the states, and then they recommend exactly how the net proceeds of the shared taxes should be distributed between the center and the states, and then how that state share should be divided among the individual states themselves.
So they take the politics out of the money.
That is the goal. They don't look at political affiliations. They look at spreadsheets and complex algorithms. They allocate funds based on objective metrics.
What kind of metrics?
Things like the population of the state, its geographical area, its forest cover. They use a critical metric called income distance, which ensures that poorer states with lower per capita income receive a higher share of funds to help them catch up to the wealthier industrialized states. They also reward states for demographic performance and fiscal discipline.
So they might look at the data and say, according to the formula, Bihar requires X thousand crores to maintain basic services, while a wealthier state like Maharashtra requires Y. And they hand that recommendation to the president.
Exactly.
But is it legally binding? Can the center just ignore the Finance Commission if they don't like the math?
Technically, the recommendations are advisory.
Oh.
However, the Constitution requires the president to lay the commission's report, along with an explanatory memorandum detailing the action taken on those recommendations, before both houses of Parliament.
So if the government decides to reject the independent formula and keep more money for themselves, they have to stand up in Parliament in front of the entire country and explain exactly why they're defying the constitutional referee.
Yes. The political cost of doing that is usually too high, so the recommendations are almost always accepted.
It provides a massive shield of transparency.
Furthermore, to protect the mutual sovereignty of both levels of government, the Constitution includes a concept known as the immunity of instrumentalities under Articles 205 and 289.
Let's break that down because it sounds incredibly dense. What does immunity of instrumentalities actually mean?
It is actually a very elegant concept. It means the center and the states cannot tax each other's property or income.
Give me an example.
The property of the union government, say, a massive central railway yard located in the middle of Kolkata is entirely exempt from taxation by the state of West Bengal. Conversely, the property and the business income of a state government are exempt from union taxation.
I see. To use an analogy, it's like two distinct businesses operating out of the same shared office building. If business A starts trying to charge business B for using the hallway, and business B responds by charging business A for using the water cooler, eventually they are just endlessly billing each other until the accounting costs bankrupt them both.
That is a perfect way to visualize it. The power to tax involves the power to destroy. If the center could tax state property, they could literally tax a state government out of existence. The immunity prevents them from cannibalizing each other.
Okay, so the Finance Commission handles the tax share, the grants cover the gaps, and they can't tax each other. But what happens if a state is just completely broke?
It happens.
Even with their share of the GST, they're running a massive deficit. They need to build a new hydroelectric dam, and they don't have the cash.
Can the chief minister just go to the World Bank or float state bonds and take out a massive loan?
Here is where we find the ultimate financial leash. Articles 292 and 293 govern borrowing powers, and the disparity here is absolute.
Secure.
The central government can borrow money both domestically within India and internationally from entities like the World Bank or foreign governments without any constitutional limit. Their borrowing is secured by the Consolidated Fund of India.
The center has unlimited credit. What about the states?
The state's borrowing powers are heavily restricted. First, a state cannot borrow internationally at all. They cannot go to a foreign bank or a foreign government. They can only borrow domestically within the territory of India.
So they are already confined, but they can still borrow from domestic banks, right? Yes, but with a massive condition. If a state owes any outstanding debt to the center, or if there is an outstanding loan for which the center has given a guarantee, the state cannot borrow a single rupee more without the explicit prior consent of the government of India.
But doesn't literally every single state in India owe some historical debt to the center?
Almost without exception, yes.
So functionally, the center has an absolute veto over any state trying to take on new debt.
Yes, and it goes further. Article 293 states that the center can impose whatever conditions it thinks fit when granting that consent.
Right, yeah.
So the center can say to a state, we will allow you to borrow this money to build your dam, but only if you agree to privatize your state power grid or cut your agricultural subsidies.
That is staggering leverage.
It is a profoundly powerful mechanism. From the center's perspective, it is absolutely necessary to enforce macroeconomic stability. If states could borrow recklessly, they could bankrupt the entire nation.
True,
But from the state's perspective, it tightly binds their economic destiny to the ideological and political whims of the center.
So, to summarize the first two phases, the center holds the most critical legislative powers, sweeps up all the undefined future powers, can legally override state laws and conflicts, and controls the deepest pockets, the sheer tax collection, and the absolute limits on borrowing.
That's the landscape.
It's a formidable machine. But as anyone who has ever tried to run a large organization knows, sitting in headquarters making the rules and holding the purse strings is only half the battle. You have to actually get the people on the ground to execute the vision.
And that reality brings us to the third phase, administrative relations. The center has the power and the money, but India is incomprehensibly vast. How does a cabinet sitting in New Delhi actually execute its will across a territory spanning from the snows of Kashmir to the beaches of Kerala?
It has to rely on the administrative machinery. And looking at Article 256, the Constitution does not politely request cooperation. It demands it.
Correct. Article 256 states that the executive power of every state must be exercised in such a way as to ensure absolute compliance with the laws made by Parliament.
So a state government, even if they violently disagree with a new federal policy, cannot simply tell their local police and their local bureaucrats, we don't like this law, so we are just going to ignore it within our borders.
Exactly. They cannot practice nullification. And to back this up, the Constitution explicitly grants the center the right to issue direct administrative instructions, binding directions to a state government to ensure they are complying. It is a rigid, hierarchical command structure.
But issuing a command from New Delhi is one thing. Who are the actual human beings carrying out these orders? Who are the boots on the ground making sure the state machinery actually moves? This brings us to a uniquely Indian institution, the All India Services, or the AIS, established under Article 312.
To understand the All India Services, you have to understand that most federations have completely separate bureaucracies. In the U.S., you have federal FBI agents and local state police. They operate in parallel. India deliberately intertwines them.
Let me try to build an analogy here. Imagine a massive multinational corporation. You have a regional manager running the branch office in, say, Hyderabad.
Okay.
That manager sits in the local office, works with the local staff, and answers to the local branch director for all their day-to-day operations. But their actual initial recruitment, their overarching salary structure, their pension, and the ultimate power to fire them isn't held by the local director. It is held exclusively by the global CEO sitting back at headquarters.
That is an incredibly accurate way to visualize it. The All India Services are the steel frame of the country. We are primarily talking about the Indian Administrative Service, the IAS, the Indian Police Service, the IPS, and the Indian Forest Service, the IFS.
How are these officers chosen?
They are recruited centrally by the union government through the Union Public Service Commission exams, which are notoriously among the most rigorous and competitive examinations on the planet. Millions apply for a few hundred spots.
Right.
But once they are recruited and trained by the center, they are allotted to different state cadres.
So an IAS officer is hired by New Delhi, but they might be sent to spend the next 30 years of their career working deep within the state government of Punjab or Karnataka or Assam.
Precisely. And they don't just work in the state. They occupy the most powerful key positions in state administration, policymaking, and law enforcement.
The top jobs.
Yes. The district magistrate who controls the administration of an entire district, the superintendent of police who controls the district's armed forces, the top secretaries in the state government ministries, these are almost exclusively all India service officers.
So how does the chain of command work?
Hmm.
If an IPS officer is running the police in a district in West Bengal, who is their boss?
While they are serving in the state, they are under the immediate operational control of the state government. The chief minister and the state home minister direct their daily work. They enforce state laws.
Makes sense.
But, and this is the source of immense friction, their fundamental service conditions and the ultimate disciplinary control lies exclusively with the union government.
What does ultimate disciplinary control mean in practice?
It means a state chief minister can transfer an IAS officer to a terrible, obscure posting if they don't like them. But the chief minister cannot dismiss the officer from service. They cannot strip them of their rank. Only the president of India, acting on the advice of the central government, can permanently penalize or fire an AIS officer.
This dual control system must cause unbelievable tension. Put yourself in the shoes of that officer. You have to keep the local state politicians happy to get anything done, but you also know that your ultimate job security, your career trajectory, is held by the central government.
It's extremely difficult.
If the chief minister orders you to do something that the prime minister's office fundamentally opposes, you're caught right in the crossfire.
It is an incredibly difficult tightrope to walk, and our sources note that conflicts routinely erupt between the union and states over the postings, transfers, and political loyalties of these officers.
I can imagine.
States frequently complain that they cannot fully discipline a recalcitrant or corrupt officer because the center protects them. Conversely, the center relies on these officers to be its eyes, ears, and hands deep within the states, ensuring national policies aren't sabotaged locally.
Why design a system with such built-in conflict? Why not just let the states hire their own top bureaucrats?
Because the design, with all its fiction, is highly intentional. The dual control ensures that these top officers maintain a degree of political neutrality and national integrity.
So they aren't just yes men to the local politicians.
Exactly. Because their ultimate job security isn't tied entirely to the local politicians, they can theoretically resist intense, localized political pressure or illegal orders from a chief minister.
It also ensures uniform administrative standards across the whole country, right? A district magistrate operating in a remote district of Assam has the exact same baseline training, the same elite perspective, and the same constitutional mandate as a district magistrate operating in the financial hubs of Gujarat.
Exactly. And our sources mention a specific vital case here, Pradeep Kumar Biswas v. Indian Institute of Chemical Biology from 2002.
What happened there?
In that case, the Supreme Court extensively discussed the nature of these services. The court recognized that they act as a binding thread in the federal structure. They are the mechanism that combines the grand national vision formulated in New Delhi with the gritty, practical, local administration required in the states.
The steel frame.
Yes, they uphold constitutional governance because ultimately they are sworn to the Constitution, not to the local political party currently holding power.
But surely federalism isn't just about the center barking orders at the states or using elite IAS officers to keep the local politicians in line. That's just a dictatorship with extra steps. There has to be a mechanism for actual cooperation, right?
Absolutely. The framers didn't just build a hierarchy of control, they built constitutional forums for dialogue. The most prominent is Article 263, which allows the president to establish an interstate council.
What does the interstate council actually do?
Its constitutional duty is to inquire into disputes that arise between states, to investigate and discuss subjects where the states and the center have a common interest, like water sharing or internal security, and to make formal recommendations for better coordination of policy.
So it is a formal mechanism to say, before we take this to the Supreme Court, before we start withholding funds or passing overriding laws, let's get the prime minister and the chief ministers around a table and hash this out.
Exactly. It recognizes that federalism requires constant negotiation.
Okay, so we have mapped out the operating system. We know how the laws are made, how the money is extracted and shared, and how the bureaucrats are managed. We see the rules of cooperation. But here's where the story gets really dark.
Yeah, the break glass in case of emergency part.
What happens when the political machinery completely breaks down? What happens when a state government goes rogue? Or when law and order totally collapses into anarchy? Or when a state government simply refuses to govern according to the Constitution?
That is the nightmare scenario the framers feared most. And dealing with it brings us to the final phase of our deep dive emergencies and judicial interpretation.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because we are stepping into arguably the most controversial, deeply scarred territory of the entire Constitution. We are talking about the drastic, almost nuclear power of Article 356, commonly known as President's Rule.
Article 356 is the ultimate manifestation of the center's supreme authority over the states.
Walk me through the mechanics. How does a state lose its democracy?
It starts with the governor of the state. If the constitutional machinery fails in a state, meaning the government cannot be carried on in accordance with the provisions of the Constitution, the governor sends a formal report to the President of India.
And based on that single report?
Based on that report, or even otherwise, if the president is satisfied on their own, the president can issue a proclamation. That proclamation essentially dismisses the democratically elected state government. The chief minister and their cabinet are fired. The state legislature is either suspended or entirely dissolved.
That is staggering. So who runs the state?
The center steps directly into the shoes of the state government. Parliament takes over the power to make the state's laws and pass the state's budget. And the president, acting locally through the governor, takes over all the executive functions of the state. It is a complete, total takeover.
Now, looking at the historical record documented in our sources, it is vital to acknowledge how this power was actually used in reality. We're looking objectively at the political history here. To be clear, we aren't taking sides.
Right, just looking at the facts.
The phrasing, failure of constitutional machinery, is incredibly vague. What's that actually mean? Is it a violent riot? Is it losing a budget vote? Because historically, the central government exploited that vagueness to use Article 356 not as a constitutional shield, but as a political weapon.
The historical record is littered with exactly that kind of misuse. For decades, if the party in power at the center saw an opposing rival political party gain power in a state, there was an intense, often irresistible temptation to use the governor's report to simply eliminate the political rival.
The sources give the specific, highly contentious example of how this power was used to dismiss the elected communist government in West Bengal and earlier in Kerala in the 1950s. The center essentially said, your ideology is incompatible with our view of governance, therefore the constitutional machinery has failed, you are dismissed.
It created a profound sense of instability. State governments lived in constant fear that if they angered New Delhi, the governor would draft a secret report and they would wake up the next morning out of a job.
And that puts a massive, uncomfortable spotlight on the role of the governor. According to Articles 153 to 167, every state has a governor appointed by the president. They are the constitutional head of the state.
Yes.
Now, normally under the parliamentary system, they're supposed to act purely on the aid and advice of the chief minister and the council of ministers.
Correct. The principle of collective responsibility means the chief minister holds the real democratic executive power as long as they have the confidence of the state legislative assembly. The governor is generally a figurehead.
Just ceremonial mostly.
Right. The landmark case of Shamsher Singh v. State of Punjab in 1974 cemented this. The Supreme Court unequivocally held that the governor must act on the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers in almost all situations. The governor reigns, but does not rule.
Except when it comes to that terrifying report to the president under Article 356. In that moment, the governor is a dual-headed figure. They are supposed to be the neutral head of the state, but they are appointed by and can be fired by the center. They are the center's eyes and ears in the state capital.
The governor is the linchpin of the centralizing bias.
So if a politically appointed governor, acting on back-channel orders from the prime minister's office, decides to send a report saying the chief minister has lost control, there is a breakdown of law and order, impose president's rule, the center can just swoop in and kill a state government.
It's a terrifying thought for any local politician.
For decades, it seemed like a massive, fatal flaw that could destroy the very concept of federalism entirely.
It was a critical vulnerability. It hollowed out the democratic mandate of state elections. But then, in a moment of profound constitutional importance, the system self-corrected.
How so?
And it didn't self-correct through politicians passing a new amendment. It's self-corrected through the judiciary.
If we are tracking the evolution of power in India, the most important development in center-state relations was a Supreme Court judgment. We need to spend serious time on this. I am talking about the landmark 1994 case of S.R. Bommai v. Union of India.
S.R. Bommai is the case that essentially saved Indian federalism from being consumed by Article 356.
Set the scene for us. What was happening in the country that led to this crisis?
In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the political abuse of Article 356 had reached a fever pitch. The central government had used the power to rapidly dismiss several state governments across the country in Karnataka, Meghalaya, Nagaland, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, and Himachal Pradesh.
A total sweep.
It was a massacre of state
The
governments.
S.R. Bomai was caught in the middle of this.
Yes. S.R. Bomai was the chief minister of Karnataka. His government was facing internal political defections. The governor of Karnataka, without even giving Bomai a chance to prove he still had a majority of support on the floor of the Legislative Assembly, what is known as a floor test, simply sent a report to the president saying Bomai had lost his majority.
Wow.
The center immediately imposed president's rule and dismissed Bomai's government.
He was locked out of his own office without even being allowed to count the votes. So Bomai didn't just accept it. He challenged this dismissal in the courts, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court of India. Now, before this case, what was the general legal consensus? Did people think the Supreme Court could even intervene?
Prior to Bomai, the prevailing view was largely that the imposition of president's rule was a political question. The assumption was that the president's satisfaction that machinery had failed was subjective and largely beyond the reach of the courts. If the president said it was necessary, the judges kept their hands off.
But in 1994, a 9-judge bench of the Supreme Court looked at the carnage of dismissed state governments and changed the rules of the game completely. What did they rule?
They handed down a historic, paradigm-shifting verdict. First and foremost, they definitively ruled that the imposition of president's rule under Article 356 is not immune from judicial review.
The Supreme Court said, we have the power to look behind the curtain.
Exactly. The court declared it has the absolute power to examine the material on which the president based their decision. The president cannot just say, I felt like the constitutional machinery failed. There has to be actual, objective, relevant material to justify such a drastic step.
So how do the mechanics of that judicial review work? How does a dismissed chief minister prove the president was wrong?
The burden is high, but the path is clear. If the dismissed state government can prove that the proclamation was based on mala fide, which means bad faith or malicious intent, or if they prove it was based on wholly irrelevant or extraneous grounds, the Supreme Court can strike the presidential proclamation down.
And here is the most incredible, breathtaking part of the judgment. The court ruled that if they find the dismissal was illegal, if they strike down the proclamation, they have the power to actually restore the dismissed state government.
It was revolutionary. The court said they could revive the dissolved state legislative assembly and literally put the chief minister back into office, undoing the president's action entirely.
That is the ultimate check and balance. In Bomai's specific case regarding Karnataka, what did the court find?
The court noted the governor's behavior was most objectionable. Dismissing a chief minister without a floor test was a violation of democratic norms. The recommendation was clearly found to be mollified.
But the Bomai judgment did much more than just set operational rules for Article 356, didn't it? It elevated the entire concept of federalism philosophically.
It did. The court explicitly declared that federalism is part of the basic structure of the Constitution.
Let's explain the basic structure doctrine, because that is a massive legal concept. What does that mean for the learner preparing for their exam?
The basic structure doctrine means there are certain fundamental principles in the Constitution that are so core to the identity of the nation that even Parliament, with a massive majority, cannot amend the Constitution to destroy them. By declaring federalism a part of the basic structure, the Supreme Court ruled that India can never be turned into a pure unitary dictatorship. The states have a permanent, unalterable right to exist.
The court emphasized that states are not mere appendages of the Union. They are not just administrative branches of New Delhi. They are supreme within their own allotted sphere.
The judgment was a profound philosophical statement. The court noted that the frequent politically motivated use of Article 356 destroys the very spirit of federalism.
Right. It ruins the trust.
They explicitly recognized the pluralist nature of Indian society, the linguistic multiplicity, the cultural diversity, and the sheer geographic vastness. They stated that federalism is the essential balancing wheel. It is the only system that can unite these separate, deeply distinct states without sacrificing their fundamental political and cultural integrity.
They were telling the center, the diversity of India requires the states to have breathing room. If you arbitrarily suffocate them with president's rule, you aren't just playing politics, you are threatening the survival of the nation.
And this highlights the ultimate, indispensable role of the judiciary in this whole massive constitutional structure. Under Article 131, the Supreme Court has exclusive original jurisdiction in any legal dispute between the government of India and one or more states. The judiciary acts as the impartial arbiter, the referee holding the rule book.
Because if you think about everything we've discussed today, the center has the legislative override, the center has the residuary powers, the center collects the massive taxes, the center controls the borrowing, and the center controls the all India services.
It's an immense concentration of power.
Without an independent Supreme Court, with the courage to strike down a president's order, the states would have been totally absorbed decades ago.
Exactly. The sources note that the state in the present day has become the major litigant. Disputes over GST compensation, disputes over the deployment of federal agencies, disputes over environmental clearances, these are constantly ending up in the Supreme Court.
It's the only place they can fight back.
The sources describe the independent judiciary as a pillar of strength for the poor, the downtrodden, and the average citizen confronting the wrath of the government. If the opinion of the executive is always allowed to prevail over the judiciary, the constitutional guarantees would be meaningless. The courts ensure that the center doesn't swallow the states, maintaining the federal balance and acting as the ultimate check on arbitrary executive power.
So after this massive journey, what does this all mean? We have gone from the high-minded fears of the framers in 1947 down to the brass tacks of tax collection algorithms and into the messy, high-stakes reality of political dismissals and Supreme Court showdowns. How do we sum up this colossal machine of center-state relations?
If we synthesize the mechanics we've explored, Indian federalism is a brilliant, highly pragmatic, and constantly evolving compromise. It is absolutely not a textbook purist federation. It is cooperative when possible through mechanisms like the GST Council and the Interstate Council, where dialogue is prioritized. It is deeply competitive when necessary, with states fighting for resources and autonomy. But fundamentally, it is designed to be highly centralized during crises to protect the integrity of the nation.
And it relies on two big things.
Yes, it relies heavily on two critical glues to hold it all together: the administrative glue of the All India services, ensuring operational continuity, and the constitutional glue of an independent judiciary that enforces the rules of the game and protects the states from annihilation.
And for you, the learner listening to this, whether you are aggressively prepping for an advanced law exam or you are just a citizen trying to understand the underlying currents of the daily news cycle, knowing how the center and states share, fight over, and negotiate power is the absolute skeleton key.
Completely agree.
If you understand the tension between the union list and the state list, if you understand the immense leverage of the Finance Commission, and if you understand the historical shadow of Article 356, you suddenly understand how Indian politics actually works. You stop seeing just politicians arguing, and you start seeing the structural forces compelling them to act.
It is the underlying operating system of the entire country.
It really is. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to chew on. We talked at the very beginning about how the framers heavily centralized power, giving the center all the overriding tools because they were terrified the fragile, newly independent country would splinter.
The trauma of 1947 dictated a strong center.
But we are looking at a fundamentally different India today. We have regional state economies that have grown absolutely massive. There are individual Indian states today like Maharashtra or Tamil Nadu that have gross domestic products and populations larger than entire European countries. They are global economic players in their own right, attracting massive foreign direct investment on their own merits.
The economic center of gravity has shifted significantly toward the states.
So the question you have to ponder is this: as these states become economic powerhouses, as they become increasingly confident in their own regional identities and capabilities, will the tight financial and legislative leash held by the center, that strict quasi-federal structure designed for a fragile nation 75 years ago, will that leash remain a source of vital national stability? Or will it increasingly become the very friction that causes this system to fracture?
That's the million-dollar question.
How much longer can a quasi-federal system manage a household of 1 billion people in a fully globalized, hyper-competitive world? Think about that chaotic household we started with. As the children grow up, start making their own money, and become highly capable, independent adults, you absolutely cannot manage them with the same strict, centralized rules you used when they were toddlers. If you try to hold on too tight, something eventually has to give. Let us know what you think. Until next time, keep digging deeper.